let's move on to cluster management. So before I show you cluster management, I need to create some repositories for it. I'm just going to delete this webinar repository because I don't need it anymore. Oh, by the way, before I go on to cluster, I'd like to mention that repositories management view has been simplified since GraphDB 7. In GraphDB 8, you can still connect to a remote GraphDB installation, but you can only use a single local directory. And that's because the local directory is configured through a GraphDB property, and everything in GraphDB, be it the Workbench, the engine, or any tools such as LoadRDF will use the same directory if you use the property. That's why it's no longer possible to connect to add any arbitrary directory on your hard disk. But if you upgrade to GraphDB 8 from a previous version and you have such locations, they'll still be in the list and they'll still be usable. So if you have them, they will continue to work. So I'm just going to delete this repository, and then for the cluster, I'm going to show you a very typical cluster setup that consists of 3 workers and 2 masters. So I will need 3 worker repositories and 2 master repositories. And normally in a production system, you will need 5 separate GraphDB installations, because in a cluster you actually want to have different machines, because if one of the machines fails, then you rely on the other machines. But for the sake of showing you how it works, it can do fine with just a single machine. So I'm going to create my worker repositories now. As I mentioned earlier, you can either click the create button, or you can press enter, and it's much easier to press enter. So there's one worker repository, and second, and finally the third worker repository. And then I will need 2 master repositories as well, which are created through the same form, but you have to change the type here from GraphDB worker to GraphDB master. And finally, I need my second master as well. There, I have now 3 worker repositories and 2 master repositories. And if I want to create a cluster now, in the past, you had to set up JMX and then do some magic with JConsole, so it wasn't very obvious how to do it. And at some point in GraphDB 7, we introduced the cluster management in the GraphDB Workbench, but cluster management wasn't completely functional, so you could create only simple clusters consisting of a single master. But now in GraphDB 8, we've extended the implementation to allow to create any kind of supported clusters. So the cluster I'm going to show you consists of 3 worker nodes and 2 master nodes, where each worker is connected to each master, and then the 2 masters are connected to each other. Sounds a bit complicated, but you'll see when I do it that it's very easy and straightforward. So to create things in the cluster management view, you click either on a worker or on a master, and then drag the mouse while keeping the button pressed onto the other thing. So if I want to connect worker 3 to master 2, I just click on worker 3, keep the button pressed, and then I drag the mouse to the master, and then I release the button, and the color of these lines between the nodes corresponds to the actual status, and it changes whenever the status changes. So you see it immediately on the screen. As you noticed, when I did that, it was red in the beginning, and then it became green. So red means off, and then green means on. So when you connect things, the initial status that you see could be either see, for the second one, it turned green immediately. So I've now connected one worker to two of the masters, to the two masters, and I need to do the same for the other two workers. There. And finally, my third worker. So don't worry if the things don't turn green immediately. The cluster might need some time to initialize and set up and communicate all that information. As you can see, they are turning green. And finally, you have to connect the two masters to each other, which is again done by dragging and dropping. So I have a cluster now, and the final thing, the very final thing left to do is to set one of the masters as read only and mute. That's because if you need to know why that needs to be done, you just you can use our documentation and read about supported cluster topologies. And now in GraphDB 8, you can simply click on a master, and then the two options read only and mode are here. So I'm just going to set it to read only and mute. And whenever you change those settings, the affected master will have these two icons. And pencil with the X means it's read only, and the speaker with the X means it's mute. And this is everything I needed to do to set up my cluster. And now let's check if this works. So if we go to the Sparkle editor, it tells me no repository selected, so I have to select one of the masters. Say I select master 1, and then I execute a simple query. And as you can see, it returns results. My cluster is working.